We are going to talk about some of the issues which were discussed this morning or this afternoon, particularly talking about the gaps and the reasons, the causes for unconstitutional change of government. You know, this is a discussion that has been ongoing on many fora. When you get to social media, it's always about young people complaining about things that have gone wrong, politicians changing constitutions, interfering with electoral laws to ensure that they rig elections. So there have been quite a number of reasons why people fight on constitution. We all do know, however, that if they are unconstitutional means in a democratic state, you try to use constitutional means to correct those unconstitutional tactics of politicians rather than using military intervention. What we are going to listen to all of these panels, where we are going to hear from them today, they're going to talk on the various issues. Start with Donald. Donald, you are going to talk about the challenges to African democracy and good governance in Africa, constructing the role of hegemonic interests. This is very interesting, Donald. Over to you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. We didn't discuss with the organizers on whether we had a shared definition of what was hegemonic interest. So I will impose mine. That's hegemony. But just to give it a short definition, in my view, it is using your might to impose your interest or your worldview over others. Often it includes military or economic might, but sometimes it could even just be an imposition of norms and ideas. So if you look at our continent, and especially from a governance point of view, we can say that there are different kinds of hegemonic interests that are imposed on us as a people. There are those happening within a single African state, where certain sections of the population are imposing themselves on others. There are those happening between African states themselves, where people from one state or a group of states are imposing themselves across one border or a number of borders. We've had African states that have invaded other African states and so on. And also we have hegemonic interest that is being imposed on us from outside of the continent. And this is being imposed on us sometimes from individual states outside the continent, sometimes our former colonial powers or other big powers that have now come up from the West or from the East, and lately it's from Eurasia, people like Turkey, you know, and so on. And there's also that's being imposed by multilateral institutions, you know, multilateral, the World Banks, the IMFs, and other bodies. So unfortunately for us as Africans, and especially from a governance point of view, there's a lot of hegemonic interest that is even confusing or compounding the leadership deficits that our own leaders already have. In certain regards, the greater problem is not even the incompetence or the corruption of our leaders, but just the corruption of the international governance system and how it imposes itself on our people. So again, what are some of the things we can do about it? And this is just opening a conversation. For in-country hegemony, we know in many of our countries, communities have been at one point victims, at other points perpetrators, at other points victims again. So we really need to think creatively and forcibly around truth, justice, and reconciliation frameworks. And to do this, we can use the language of human rights. We can use the language of transitional justice. The AU passed in 2019 a very comprehensive African Union transitional justice policy framework that provides a whole menu, not a checklist, a whole menu of things that you can pick to see what suits your context and work with it. And when that doesn't work, we can engage national mechanisms or the courts. For cross-country hegemonies, again, I would say that it could sometimes be positive, it could sometimes be negative. And I'll give just one example. A generation ago, Nigeria, as the hegemon of West Africa, the most powerful state, was able to enforce peace, stop conflict in a number of sister states, using not just its military might, but also its moral stature. So it can be positive. But we also have complaints by African countries that are being looted by other African countries, invaded by other African countries. So there we need to look at the dispute resolution mechanisms of the AU and also of the regional economic communities. And when I say dispute resolution, it's not just courts, although we do have a range of courts and tribunals. It's the peace and security architectures, where we can go as states to debate issues of peace building, and so on. And then also let's look at the deliberative bodies and legislative bodies, things like the Pan-African Parliament, the ECOWAS Parliament, the SADC Parliamentary Forum, and how these dialogue spaces can be spaces even for us as citizens to engage a section of our leadership so that issues can be surfaced, so that especially African states can truly be sister states rather than trying to impose on each other. And as for international hegemony, let's see how working together with other progressive forces, we demand, not beg for change, we demand for reform of international governance, reform of the UN, reform of the UN Security Council, reform of the World Bank, reform of IMF, reform of other slightly smaller bodies that actually have a lot of influence in our countries, but we forget, like the Bank for International Settlements, like the Financial Action Task Force, and so on. So let's see how we gang up. We, as several Pan-African organizations, are members of the Stop the Bleeding Consortium, which is part of a larger Stop the Bleeding campaign, looking at issues of illicit financial flows, lately issues of debt, extractive industry, and it's about demanding reform in our lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald, for sticking within the time and for that very interesting conversation. You know, it's always interesting that we learn new things every day. And when you spoke about hegemony in the sub-region, I can vividly recall the irony of Nigeria being a military dictator and forcing democracy in Sierra Leone and Liberia. and Nigeria is now the hub for anti-money laundering. And you can imagine that, you know, it's very interesting that we have to look at it. I also think an interesting point you spoke about is the AU Transitional Justice Framework, which I think is very important for us because for countries like Rwanda, South Africa, and Sierra Leone, where we had conflict in the 1990s, we had to copy from outside to actually institute transitional justice. So it's important for us to begin to look at. There's a clarion call, and this is important also for reforms of the World Bank, the IMF, particularly the United Nations. How we get to that is another question. Let me go to our next speaker. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. So we are all tired from lunch, I think, but I ask you to please just pay attention for at least the first 2 seconds of what I'm about to say. On the 9th of July, so 2 days ago, was the 20th anniversary of the formation of the African Union. Yes? Basically formed from the SADC Declaration in Durban, South Africa. That group of leaders, in sporting terms, in celebrity terms, and entertainment terms, we would call them GOATs, the greatest of all time, in terms of legendary status. And what they left us with, if you think about what they have given us in terms of the structure of the African Union, they leveled up from the OAU to create the African Union. My question to all of us in the room, and I'm civil society on one hand, on the other hand, I work in the commercial space from an economic investment funding, et cetera, into Africa. So I wear a couple of hats every day, all day. My question to all of us, wearing our different hats, but specifically under the guise of civil society, is what is going to be this generation, our generation's legacy? Who are going to be the GOATs, so to speak, of us sitting here right now? How are people, the next generation, going to talk about this generation's legacy? Because we got the African Union from a previous generation, not from us, right? So let's go to my point, my topic of conversation, which is economic investment from a resilience, strengthening resilience and governance. So let's talk about this resilience. To increase resilience, it's the democracy that must be shown to work. We've got to show that democracy is working. Otherwise, that resilience doesn't exist. We've heard about this many times in the previous sessions. So I'm not going to go into that because we are all tired. But the thing that I want to say from working across the continent, and because I've got a private sector background, my mind has to always shift into political gear and then back and forth, purely because, you know, there's a different narrative in each space. But the thing that always comes to mind is that democracy is always spoken about in terms of championing and all of those kind of things. We never think about democracy from the perspective of investment and money and what that means for us in terms of what it does. We get so consumed by the politics of it, and we have to. I'm not saying we mustn't. I'm just here to kind of bring a different perspective to it. So I'm asking you to just not wear a political hat too much as I tell you what I'm about to tell you, because at the end of the day, the world runs on money. It runs on currency. That's the currency of the world. We measure everything in terms of that. So politics, the political side of it and the power and all of that is great. But how do we now start to look at creating that different culture within our system? And when we look at economic investment on the continent, the thing that we must be mindful of, because, and I'm saying something that is not rocket science, we all know this, but yet we still don't do it, is that we've got to balance Pan-Africanism with neocolonialism, or the potential for neocolonialism. If we don't balance that, if we don't pay attention to it, then we are going to be in the very situation, and I'm talking about, remember I said, what is our generation going to do in the future? So I'm looking this way. I'm not looking current and I'm not looking backwards. We are going to be spoken about in exactly the way that we have complained. 17 people, if I counted correctly, right, Donald? 17 people spoke about the challenges that we are having. And a lot of that comes down to who are we being driven by and who are we being told what to do by. So when we look at investment, it is a balancing act in terms of Pan-Africanism and achieving our goals, our agenda, and not those of where we get investment funding and aid from. So I just want to give you two perspectives because I don't have much more time. I just want to give you two perspectives. There are hundreds of tools that measure measure investment factors. So investors around the world and in Africa sit there and they look at various tools that tell them something about a country. And that's how they invest, right? Technically. But these tools, just out of interest, most of them are not controlled by us. First point. Second point, the tools that we use to measure ourselves, have we asked ourselves the question, is it the tools that the investors are using to invest in us? And therein lies a gap. The second aspect of it is that sometimes, for example, one of the, and I'll just give you one tool, is the ICIFA, or the Investor Confidence Indicator for Africa. And they measure it on 12 factors. I'm specifically staying away from the normal ones that everyone knows about, purely because I don't want to have issues. And they look at it from three perspectives, which is security, development, and good governance in terms of root of law. But there are 12 factors that they use to determine investor confidence, right? And those 12 factors, very, very quickly, is one, ease of doing business. If you can't do business properly in a country, is not going to happen. That is the biggest one. Corruption, and they use the corruption index, they use the Transparency International. So are we, when we develop policies, when we develop guidelines, are we looking at how we are being measured and how we are being seen, or do we develop policies in our, what we call a filter bubble? Press freedom, economic freedom. How do we look at economic freedom? Human development and human rights, global competitiveness, fragile states index. How fragile are we when we look at it from a peace and security perspective? Freedom in the world. So who are we as citizens? Basically our passport and what our passport can do for us and where we come from. And the global peace index. The EIU democracy index, index of African governance. And here's the interesting thing, is that the Mo Ibrahim governance is what is used to determine this particular one and not the African Union's one. Interesting, right? And then obviously ICT development. In this particular case, I just want to show you, I just want to contextualize the story for you. Somalia is the worst country on the continent, according to this index. It sits at an overall score of 16.81 out of 100. And the best country to invest in, according to this particular index, is Botswana. And Botswana sits at 65%. I'm trying to get to it quickly. 64.87%. Nigeria is bang smack in the middle. So this tells you, and it's the 12 points that I gave you in terms of, you know, how we are measured. Remember, there are also people that want to invest in a country because press freedom is bad. I'm from South Africa. Civil society. We know the story of South Africa. Civil society is the reason South Africa has political freedom. It is also the reason we do not have economic freedom. So civil society held and holds the power. We, you, me, the civil society. ECOSOCC is here to say to us, AGA is here to say to us, APSA, APRM, even AFDB is in the room to say, what do we want to say to them? How are we going to organize ourselves? How are we going to conduct ourselves in a way that we drive certain things?
There is a long history of civil society in Africa, and there are many things that have changed across Africa that have led us where we are, where you see more NGOs than other forms of civil society. Now, let's park that discussion because it's a long one, and I don't have enough time to go into it. But if you go to the next slide, the first point I wanted to make very quickly is that democracy is not meant to be static. I think when we are discussing democracy, that's the first thing you have to put in your mind, that democratic cultures actually evolve and they change just as our lives change. It doesn't mean that the principles and the fundamentals change, but the ways in which we engage with democracies can themselves change. If you think about how we are consuming information today, how we are engaging with each other today, as citizens across Africa and in communities, there are several changes. Now that means that the way in which democracy becomes practiced has to be able to respond to those kinds of changes. So that's just a preamble to say that if therefore you look at some examples, you'll see that there are several changes that have happened across the world. And I won't go into the detail. But even if you just look at democratic reform and what it has meant, things where we have seen significant change are, for example, things like money, the role of money in elections, in democracies have become something that is fundamentally new. Issues like political term limits and what they mean. There is a very interesting clip from our dear president from Rwanda about this whole thing about questioning term limits. There is the role of women on gender and how that has changed the practice of democracy. The country I come from today, it's very rare to have a panel of more men than women because actually the president, apart from him, the vice president, the speaker of parliament, the ministry, you have like 40% of the cabinet now as women. And that has shifted a number of things. You can talk about those who are not there on the table, but at least you can see that for young girls looking at those women, the optics have changed. Issues of youth participation. I think listening to the number of youth in this room who we are talking about representing young people's organizations shows you that we are dealing with significant changes. And other things like globalization and what it has done to us. Everybody is following all the news in the world. We know what's happening in Ukraine. We know what's happening in Sri Lanka. We know what's happening all over the place. Now, the thing is that I just want to quickly move to what then does that mean in terms of capacities. What that means in terms of capacities is that there are 4 capacity development for what we call civil society and not NGOs alone. And it has to be a bit deeper. It has to be about creating approaches that allow us to question power, but also question vested interests, so that we both understand them, but also reform them. And also, there are other elements that we need to sort of deal with, which are beyond just power and vested interest. Because when you do capacity development, you want to have civil society organizations that have instruments that allow them to play their effective role in a democracy or in democratic governance. You can't have democratic governance without having democracy every day. So that is something that is happening. This has arrived. Now, where do I look to know which slide I am on? Do I look behind me? I think this is therefore not very helpful. Please keep going so that you use my laptop. So when we go to the next slide, I want to quickly say that you have to note that investments in capacities for effective engagement are needed on both sides. When we talk about capacity development, let's not get lumped into the idea that it's only civil society that needs capacity. You need supply side investments and you need demand side investments. Citizens need capacities to organize, to articulate their views, to express their opinions. But organizations and institutions like the African Union, our member states, our governments also need capacities, which are to establish and use CSO mechanisms. Because if you have capacity as a civil society organization and your government has no capacity to engage with you, it will be useless and futile because your capacity will be going nowhere. So that's why we need to build capacity within governments to actually understand how do you deal with civil society. I'm one of those lucky few people who have worked in the Ministry of Finance for nearly a decade and have worked in civil society for more than a decade. And I'll tell you that if you don't create capacity of people who understand both sides, it is always very difficult to engage. Now, but what does capacity, therefore, what should it be delivering? I think what it should be delivering is a number of things. One, if you go on to the next slide, it should be delivering voice for civil society to know how to voice their concerns. And voice is not just shouting. Voice is about having the ability to articulate clearly, empirically through studies and those kinds of things, but also capacity to engage and to participate effectively. When they call you to a meeting, how do you prepare? What kinds of things do you do? But also capacity to demand change when performance is poor. I think that's also something that we must build into what we call civic engagement, where you say if something is not working, how do we change it? But also capacity to work with institutions where you need corrective measures. Because, you know, sometimes we have these civil society organizations, we usually joke in Uganda, which do one thing to every problem. Every problem, we have a press conference. Every problem, there is a press conference. And capacity cannot be only in one area, because you see, you can't define a problem in terms of one thing. But as I end now, one is capacity must also culminate, if you go to the next slide, in a number of areas. One of them is it must culminate into what we call reliable, legitimate, and people-centered ground rules. I didn't say constitutionalism and all these terms which my colleague would have loved to hear, but that's the thing. And when I say ground rules, really it's to say the way we practice democracy, the way we treat each other, the way citizens treat each other and governments. Those are the ground rules that we need. They need to be reliable and legitimate. And therefore, that's why you need capacity to be able to build and influence that reliability. The other thing is increased objectivity and evidence-based, as well as participatory decision-making. As you know very much that one of the struggles we have in many countries is for people who speak and the only thing they have read is the newspaper and the Bible. And in between, they don't know anything. And they think that they can comment on every topic. And they are on talk shows and all these things. So that's why we tell them to do a little bit more. Then we also need the other element is transparency, access to information, and awareness. I think when we have capacity, one of the things that you always demand is to know more. Actually, the thing about capacity is the thing it does to you is opens your mind to read more. Actually, the people who read most are the professors. You would have thought that they would end reading, but they always read until they go to their grave. And this is what should happen, that the more you have capacity, is you should be able to use it more. Then also it should lead to mandating and maintaining things like regular monitoring of issues. This is the last slide, my dear brother, and it has only 3 points. One of them is to say we need to also build what we call moving accountability loops so that citizens are closer to governments. This is an important thing, but I won't elaborate it. The other one is to have meaningful participation in all these processes that we've been talking about at a continental level, at a country level, and even lower. But also ultimately, we need to strengthen citizens' voice, but also their ability to articulate the needs and opinions that they have. So these are really major frameworks that I've put out. But the idea is to say that when we talk about civil society capacity for democratic reform, it is something larger than just going for a 2-day workshop and having break teas and dinner and cocktails. Thank you very much for listening.
When you said that this is the graveyard session, of course, so you can have the graveyard of the graveyard session if you go second to last. So I will talk very briefly about the role for citizen polling in democratic resilience. This morning, I think we had so many speakers tell us about the importance of public opinion and how it should shape policy and government affairs. And I think I don't really need to spend so much time really talking about this again. Just to say, I think a couple of points, I think, on the issue of public opinion polling. Firstly, I think it is said that the voice of the people is the voice of God. And this actually goes back, way back, I think, in the 14th century, when kings of England used to claim the divine right of kings, that they were ordained by God. And I think, people said, the divine is the people. The people is God themselves. So you cannot say as a ruler, you are above and more important than those over whom you rule. But of course, it's also important to highlight that the voice of public opinion is not always correct. Throughout history, I think people believed that, for example, the world was flat. And the public opinion was so strongly in favor that, yes, the world was flat, that if we walk to the ends of the earth, we'll just fall into this chasm at the end of it all. But we know that now the world is round. So public opinion, I wanted to highlight this up front, can it be wrong? And the public opinion is also not the opinion of the most outspoken members of society. There are some among us who speak and people listen to. It does not mean that our voices are the voices of the people or represent public opinion. And I highlight this because as a civil society, sometimes we like to speak and believe that we are speaking on behalf of the people. And politicians also make the same mistake, telling us that, oh, the people want me to do this. I think you agree with me. In the countries on the continent where we've seen presidents remove term limits, for example, they've always argued that, oh, the people want me to stay, and I'm just doing what the people want me to do. And of course, we know that this is not necessarily correct. Even if some people support such moves, it does not necessarily mean they represent the views of the people. And I say this as a preamble to what I'm going to present about measuring public opinion. And I think we can skip, I think, the first couple of slides because of in the interest of time. So public opinion, needless to say, is important for democratic politics. Indeed, it is said that unless the voices or the mass views have some place in the shaping of policy, or talk about democracy is nonsense. We cannot just talk about democracy without taking into consideration the voices of the people. Indeed, the voices of the people themselves are the driving, as it says, the driving force linking really government and electoral accountability, and linking leaders in a democratic nation so that we can ensure that leaders do not deviate from the wishes of those who vote for them. Now, why am I saying this? We've seen, for example, in Mali, when the military coup took place, people rushing and running on the streets celebrating the military coup. Does that mean Malians no longer support democracy? Public opinion, especially the way we measure it, can actually show us that maybe what Mali were celebrating is a government or a leadership that would address their concerns about insecurity, and not necessarily that they renounce democratic politics. So this is really where Afrobarometer and the other measures and other organizations that measure democracy and measure public opinion come in. So as the Afrobarometer, if we can just move very quickly to the next slide, Afrobarometer operates across the continent in about 40 countries. There are some countries that the Afrobarometer is not working in, but we work and collect and capture public opinion data on a range of issues, indeed on issues that sometimes ordinary citizens have never been asked before. So looking at public opinion data, we begin to see how I think some of the arguments that are made by our political leaders, made by elites, sometimes really diverge from the views of ordinary citizens themselves. Well, I don't have control over my slide, over the slides. If we can just move to the next two slides, if you could move to the next two slides, please. So, yes, move next, please. And next again. So that's the map, the Afrobarometer map, and these are the countries that we are operating in, and mostly in West Africa, Southern Africa, East Africa, but there's a gap in the middle that we are not working in, but we are always working towards adding new countries to the Afrobarometer map so that we can cover the entire African continent. And what do we learn from the Afrobarometer surveys, especially in terms of what ordinary citizens think about how they are governed? So if we can move, please, quickly, because I only have 1 or 2 minutes now. So the Afrobarometer is 2 minutes. So have I given myself? Oh, so I get 4 minutes. Okay. I'm good at maths, So I think, the Afrobarometer, for example, we measure, I think, attitudes towards the authoritarian rule. You agree with me that a lot of, observers of African politics see leaders, remaining in office for so long. They see the military coups that take place and jump to the conclusion that African citizens themselves are supportive of authoritarian rule. But from measuring public opinion data, we actually see that most African citizens reject authoritarian rule. In terms of military rule, 3/4 of the citizens on the continent reject military rule. So, and this also applies to countries that have actually just overthrown their governments and embraced military rule. African citizens, again, just slightly more than 3 in 4 of the citizens on this continent tell us that they don't want one-party rule, and their about 4 in 5 tell us they do not want also one-man rule dictatorship. So strong rejection of military, of authoritarian rule. And the graph on the right, I guess, right or left now? It's on my left, but it will be on your right. It just highlights, I think, the strength of rejection of military rule on this continent. That we have countries there. I'm just looking. Yeah, I mean, Burkina Faso is at the bottom with only 44% of Burkinabe rejecting military rule. But you see some of the countries that have just really, had a military coup, so strongly rejecting. If we can move to the next slide. And I think the issue of presidential term limits, again, strong rejection of what presidential term limits, as I highlighted, about 3/4 of the citizens on the continent supporting the institution or constitutional clauses to limit their presidency to serving just a maximum of 2 terms. So even if, in countries like my favorite country, of Uganda, again, a strong support for presidential term limits, even though these were removed nearly 20 years ago now. Again, in terms of democracy, sometimes I think there are people who tell us that, democracy is not an African concept. Yes, granted that democracy, I think, it comes in a different, variants. But again, we see strong support for democracy on the African continent, as well as, I think, other democratic institutions. And this is just really a snapshot. And I just wanted to highlight, I think, the case of Mali and Burkina Faso, where, again, measuring public opinion does tell us that, again, the Malians and the Burkinabe want democracy, but at the same time, they feel that their governments have not been doing a good job in, addressing insecurity in the country. Long and short, I think there is a space for measuring public opinion, and if we do a good job in measuring it, I think we can also use this to counteract, I think, decisions and statements made by some of our political leaders. I apologize for abusing that 2 minutes extra.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So I was once asked by a student and says, why is it that professors like hearing themselves and think they are gods in the classroom? And the student called it, it says the dangers of professors. So it's understandable when you have a professor. But the thing is, clearly your figures are fascinating, and I will ask that your presentation is shared with everybody, because it seems like this is something that really informs what we've been talking about, what people think, and especially the things that we want to hear, the percentages against one party rule, the military rule, one man rule. These are things that as democracy activists, we want to propagate. And if we say, it's Afrobarometer, it carries up that weight. So we love that. And clearly it seems like everyone wants a democracy at this point in time. Whether democracy itself is perfect or not is another discussion that we have. But we also understand that, the voice of the people is not the voice of God. When we had the Arab Spring, who were in school and someone asked, but the 8 million people who are marching in the streets of Egypt, are they more than the 28 million people who voted for the president? So if 8 million is asking for him to resign and 28 people voted for him, how can you say he should resign because 8 people came out on the street? These are conversations that are very complex, in terms of this, but this is very interesting. Our next speaker, of course, is my brother, Andrew Songa. You have the floor.
Thank you again very much for the opportunity to be able to have this brief discussion with you at this very important citizens forum. And what I want to do very quickly with the few minutes that I have is to utilize the window of a project that I am a part of to help us imagine and explore the potential of using civic technology to address some of the issues we started discussing earlier in the day, and that's enhancing public participation and focusing on greater implementation of the democratic principles that we have all embraced as an African Union citizenry, and particularly in the African Charter for Democracy, Elections and Governance. And so that's why it is Charter Africa that I represent. It's a 6-member project consortium, 4 African organizations, 2 European-based ones, that are implementing a project that is aimed at enhancing citizen participation in implementing the principles of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, but stimulating that citizen engagement through the use of civic technology. And I will ask the members at the back to switch quickly to the 4th slide so that I can then explain why. Next slide. Yes. So why do we focus on civic technology? It's because, like we had discussed earlier in the morning from our esteemed panelists, particularly from the AGA Secretariat, we recognize that under Agenda 2063, we emphasize the aspiration towards governance that is anchored on democracy, rule of law, and justice, and that underpinning these key principles is the importance of public participation so that you have a people-centered and people-driven leadership. So where does civic technology come in? The way we understand it as Charter Project Africa is simply that civic technology are those technological or digital tools that the public are able to access and utilize to mobilize, to organize, and to engage in governance discussions, and to also shape the thinking and decision-making of our duty bearers or our policymakers, or essentially those in power. And so that's why I emphasize here that if you properly utilize civic technology, what you should be getting is an expanded space for public engagement in matters of governance. Next slide, please. But then civic technology and its use doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are certain things that work for it, and there are certain things that work against it. And so one of the things that works for civil society and for civil society using civic technology has been the fact that it has been utilized to help us eclipse or overcome the challenge of shrinking civic space as we had earlier in the day, where we are not able to meet in person, where we are facing restrictions to galvanize and engage in public discussions openly. We found that sometimes civic technology fills in that gap and helps people effectively mobilize. We heard of the use of smartphones in galvanizing public protests. We've heard of the use of different smartphone apps being used to galvanize and harness public opinion, as I'll show in other examples in my later slides. And we've also seen civic technology used very innovatively by civil society organizations as part of the tools they use in early warning conflict mitigation strategies, as was discussed earlier in the day. And then what are some of the challenges? We do realize that as we begin to succeed in using civic technology, it is not impervious to the challenges that ordinary civic space faces. What do I mean? We have seen state backlash against the use of civic technology to organize and mobilize. So things like internet shutdowns or cyber surveillance have become things that we also have to address. And therefore, the overall conversation we were having earlier about preserving civic space still applies when you talk about civic technology. And then, of course, there's the aspect of access. Somebody mentioned earlier, I think one of our esteemed members from the APRM mentioned something about the fact that we don't have enough penetration of the internet, of access to the internet across the continent, and even bridging the rural-urban divide becomes an important thing to focus on. So while the African Union, for example, has a digital transformation strategy, we need to think about how much investment has been made to make sure that access is enhanced at all levels for all citizenry, but then also that access and the utilization or the potential of the internet is not just about economic progress, but it's also about expanding spaces for governance conversations. Next slide. So that's where we come in as the Charter Project Africa, and I just want to use some of the examples of the initiatives we are undertaking to try and exploit the potential of civic technology to help us begin to think about what we can do with the civic technology and digital engagement space in terms of bridging the democratic governance deficits that we encounter every day. Next slide. We have a series of target countries that we are focusing to provide a series of grants to innovative civil society organizations that are thinking around how to use civic technology, and I will be discussing that shortly. Next slide. And so the approaches we are trying to amplify through the work we are doing is to build capacities and then also tap into innovative experiments that are being undertaken by civic engagement initiatives, further dialogues on governance, both on digital and civic tech spaces, but also about how to utilize those spaces, and then build better, foster closer engagements between the African Governance Architecture Platform members and civil society. Next slide. So next slide, please. So just to give an example of the potential that civic technology presents. We discussed a lot about being informed earlier in the day and the importance of getting information. So one of the things that you can utilize civic technology for is to create platforms where you can consolidate the knowledge and make it accessible to different groups of people, whether it's the youth, whether it's student groups, whether it's civil society organizations, so that they can know more about AGA, for example, so that they can know more about the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. And so one of the things we want to do is set up an evidence platform that consolidates all these different governance instruments and creates relatable tools of how you can use them in your day-to-day advocacy, and therefore get more people informed about these principles and how they relate to your day-to-day lives. Next slide. So this is just a bit of an example of what it would look like. You will have a virtual evidence page on our website that will have different tools that can be used, whether it's apps that can be used to monitor certain situations or apps that can be used by civil society organizations to group and organize members, knowledge products around democratic governance issues, and then also continue posting about opportunities for access to funds that can prop up some of the activities that civil society organizations want to do. Next slide. Then the important aspect that we also want to invest in very much is the massive open online course, an free online accessible course on democracy, elections, and governance in Africa, delivered by a series of key leaders within the African Union, key scholars from the continent, unpacking key aspects of the democratic governance debate. What does it mean to talk about monitoring elections? What does it mean to link the aspect of political participation and gender? What does it mean to discuss peace, security, and elections? So we have that open online course currently available. We encourage as many people to be able to tap into it, register, subscribe, and take the course, and also share it with others as a way of building greater capacities and knowledge around democratic governance issues. Next slide. So that's what it essentially looks like, and you'll be able to see different courses, the dates for them, and how to be able to engage in the said courses. Next slide. So basically, creating an ecosystem where we are able to highlight the work that's being done by some of the grantees. We give grants to undertake civic tech projects, being able to post contemporary news items around democratic governance debates, creating spaces for people to be able to discuss those debates, and then also creating learning opportunities forms the entire ecosystem of that virtual evidence platform. Next slide very quickly. So then I will close by just highlighting some of the grants that we have issued under this project as a way of showing what kind of work that exists out there with regards to civic technology and advancing democratic governance. Next slide. Next slide. So like I mentioned, we have some country-specific grants that are still under selection, and we're hoping to get some very nice innovative projects within those countries. But then there are 4 grants that we have already commissioned with 4 civil society organizations that are focused on engaging with the African governance architecture in as far as democratic governance is concerned. Next slide. So, for example, we have an organization known as the Civio Institute. And what they want to focus on is to utilize technology to track electoral promises from those who seek political office, gain political office, and they want to track from your campaigns and the promises you made, what promises actually translate into policy actions, and how much have you done to implement those policy actions. And so that they would be targeting governments within Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And the hope is through that active conversation, voters will be able to assess in a very comprehensive way what it means to move from the rhetoric of the political campaigns to the running of government, and whether it actually translates into changed democratic advancements within those contexts. In Kenya is another parliamentary monitoring organization called Mzalendo Trust. And what they want to do is create a platform that bridges the public participation gap. It puts proposed laws, bills online, and encourages engagement of the public with those bills to provide their input as the bills go through the different stages of being turned into law, and consolidating those public views into memorandum that are actually tabled in parliament for parliamentarians to consider when they're passing those laws. The next slide. And then you have a Tanzanian organization, MSTDC. And what they are doing is upscaling an initiative they already have within working with the African Union that is called ULEAD Unplugged, creating spaces of dialogue between the youth and African Union leadership. And in this way, creating themes that can encourage the youth to directly engage in day-to-day top debates on governance issues, such as unconstitutional changes in government, and ensuring that their voices are heard at the highest levels of policy making within the African Union level. And then finally is Deya South Africa, which also uses a similar format of trying to track the development processes of laws and encouraging public input within the same. So what that all then does is it creates a space of increased public engagement that can then translate into more constructive dialogue with different policymakers. And what we hope to do is maximize on that through spaces such as these, where we eventually then begin to engage with the African Union organs. And you can click on the next slide, and the next slide again, next slide, so that we can then create that space of national advocacy translating to influencing regional continental goals. So for example, I already mentioned speaking within the spaces of the African governance platform becomes very key to translate a lot of the things that are hard at the national level into the oversight work that the African governance platform has with regards to member states. Next slide. So finally, the last element has to be about policy analysis and strategy. So like I mentioned, there's a lot that can be said about maximizing on civic technology and public engagement. So as much as I've shown some of those examples that exist with regards to ongoing initiatives, there's a lot of reflection that still needs to be done in terms of how we can enhance civic technology as a key tool for citizen engagement. And that's where policy analysis becomes important. Some people talked about reflecting on the ACDEG earlier. I may not be a strong proponent of saying we need to amend the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, but we can reflect on how it remains relevant to our current situation. So for example, when we passed the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, we weren't speaking about a very strong aspect of digital engagement at the time. We weren't talking about people organizing online as much as they do now. So perhaps what we need to start thinking about is whether the ACDEG as a framework appropriately reflects how we organize and how we discuss on matters of democratic governance, especially now that we have these tools of civic technology and digital engagement with us, and also the challenges that come with it, such as the fact that we're in the era of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech being propagated. So we need to think about how we can then make sure that the ACDEG is still reflective of our challenges today, and how then we can update its responsiveness to some of the issues we are dealing with. So perhaps that's through guidelines, that's through policy positions, rather than overall amendments. So with that, I thank you for your time and hope that I would have been able to just give a small snapshot of what the possibilities civic technology presents for us as we think about enhancing public participation in democratic governance. Thank you.
The opportunities that I think you spoke about, the grant, our colleagues are here who are in these countries that will look forward to applying for your next grant cycle. So you have to speak to them about the opportunities that we have. But everything is going online. Governments are afraid of the mobilizations that are taking place on the online platforms, and it's also good for us to continue to expand. Thank you for that. We are going to the next session. It's your turn.
Thank you. My name is Justice Oman. I'm a lawyer from Ghana, and I'm also representing the AACC, Liaison Office to the African Union. My issue has to do with the constitutions in the countries, the nature of the constitutions. If we look at the historical background, we realize that most of these constitutions that were brought in post-independence were actually constitutions that were designed by the colonial rulers. And these constitutions didn't have accountability to the citizenry in mind. So post-independence, we realized that most of our leaders who were engaged in the independence struggle more or less copied and pasted these constitutions. And when they found themselves in power, they were more comfortable because it sought to protect them, and there was less, it demanded less accountability to the citizenry. And that is what has since then become the norm. So it becomes very difficult for leadership to account to the citizens, and citizens also expecting leaders to account, but then there are no avenues for any form of accountability. And then people are forced to use other means of making sure that they get what they want. The other challenging factor also is that when things are going wrong and leaders are not accounting to their people, the African Union comes in and says sovereignty. We cannot come in and interfere in the issues affecting states. But then when citizens rise, African Union comes in and says, respect the treaties that you have signed. And that is where the gap is.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. And my question is just with the last presenter who spoke about digital engagement, civics technology and digital engagement. So, you spoke very well about the access to digital space and how civic, the civil society and basically the citizens can engage, and especially with the youth. I just wanted to hear, maybe probably it was part of your presentation because of the time you're not able to present, but I've not heard you speak about addressing the violations of the human rights that happens through this digital access that has been ongoing. There's also been a discussion that we've been speaking about when it comes to digital engagements. By violations of human rights, I mean about situations where we have defenders of human rights, especially during elections, where we see governments actually go ahead and violate and get to access and get to locate these people and get to arrest them. And I think all has been discussed. But again, we have realized that this also comes as a challenge of technology. So my question to you is basically, does this project actually speak to how we can protect these people? And also in a second example is basically speaking to the gender discussion, where there's been a lot of violation, especially women have been very much publicly violated through the digital spaces. So basically, I've not had, from your whole project framework, how basically do you plan to protect or to try and see how you can navigate this access to actually avoid some of these violations that have been ongoing across the digital spaces? Thank you.
Very much. I'm Dixon Chirwa, a law student from the University of Zambia. My question is in line with the presentation for, thank you very much. My question is in line with the presentation by Ms. Yavi Madurai. So I quote, she said, we wish to foster economic wealth creation in Africa among the youth and women. She said, we'll talk about making money in Africa. So my question is in regards with the economic wealth creation. Is it just through the grants, or maybe you've got other means, other businesses that you are actually promoting, or maybe you've got other ventures in place apart from the grants? What exactly are you doing in order to bring about the economic wealth creation in Africa among us, the youths, and the women in particular? Thank you.
From the University of Zambia. I have a few observations, but before that, may I appreciate the presenters who have presented so far for giving us a fairly good presentation throughout the meeting. I've come to a conclusion, having listened to the presentation, that Africa's worst enemy is not in the West, but rather it is fear, the fear of having a self-coined definition of who a true African is. Now, my thing is this: Africa is well known for good policies. Africa is well known for good treaties. We are well known for good constitutions. We are well known for good ideologies, but I'm yet to know Africa for good implementation of these things. And that's where the problem is now. And that is what we are supposed to be talking about. We have radical speakers in Africa. What we are lacking are radical actors. And we ought now to go into an era of acting upon the policies, the conventions, the treaties that we have come up with ourselves. The other problem that I have is that Africa is fighting so much to be where the people we perceive to be our enemies are, especially those in the West, instead of working on being a better us, a better Africa. That is the problem that we should seriously work on. The other problem that I have in Africa is the fear of standing for what we believe in, owing to the fact that most of our funders are those we perceive to be our enemies, yet we are dining and wining with them behind the closed doors. Now, this is an appeal also to the civil society organizations that are present here and also that are outside there, but who have an opportunity to perhaps listen to this appeal. The highest order of hypocrisy is claiming to speak for people you don't even speak to. Most of these civil society organizations, including those that are present here, they don't remember the last time they engaged the public to hear from them, so as in to foster their interest. Unfortunately, they just speak for themselves and claim to speak for us. So as you work on improving their capacity, see to it, AU, that these people are in touch with the grassroots. Thank you so much.
Bonjour à tous. Je suis Maître Brunel Sendieba, avocat au barreau de Centrafrique. Je suis aussi le coordonnateur adjoint du réseau des défenseurs des droits de l'homme dans mon pays. Et je remercie les panélistes parce que toutes leurs interventions se recoupent et donc ça nous permet de poser cette question. La démocratie ne se limite pas aux élections parce que les élections se déroulent chaque 4 ans ou 5 ans ou 7 ans. Mais seulement, il faudrait que la population s'investisse chaque jour pour demander aux dirigeants de rendre compte. Nous ne pouvons pas demander aux dirigeants de rendre compte chaque 5 ans. Ils gèrent le pays chaque jour et donc nous devons, nous, population, au sein de nos organisations respectives, leur demander à nous rendre des comptes sur les réalisations, sur la gestion quotidienne. Mais si nous passons seulement notre temps à aller voter, et vous voyez, c'est parce qu'effectivement, nous avions démissionné devant ce fait, nous avions cantonné nos contrôles rien que pour le vote, et c'est pour cette raison qu'il leur est facile de modifier facilement la Constitution. Mais si nous sommes présents sur le terrain chaque jour pour les contrôler, ça va les inquiéter, et ils vont se dire, ah, ces gens-là, puisqu'ils nous surveillent constamment, il sera difficile pour nous de faire autre chose que ce qui est dans la Constitution. Et donc, nous aussi, au même moment où nous sommes en train de vouloir empêcher le contrôle de la Constitution, nous devons, dans nos actions quotidiennes, respecter aussi nos textes et aussi respecter la Constitution pour faire prévaloir le droit. Voilà ce que j'avais à dire. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much. So my question is directed to Mr. Andrew Songa from the Charter Project Africa. So, thank you. So one thing that we've come to realize is that, the challenges of African countries at times are very relative. Let's take, for instance, the issue of peace and security and whatnot. So my question really is, does your organization or your body have a framework where there is skills sharing platforms? For example, we have countries like Zambia where the transition of power has been largely democratic, peaceful, and even the aftermath has been peaceful thereof. So are there platforms within your network where you can get models that are working in one country and try to apply those same peace building and unity frameworks in different countries? I believe this is something that can work for other countries. My organization pioneered the peace protocol that was leading up to last year's election, and it went to the highest corridors of power in our land, and even our politicians were able to sign peace pledges from what we began. So this kind of frameworks and models could be something that other African countries are also emulating. So does your organization and your body have such a platform so that we are able, as civil society organizations from different countries, to help each other implement the same goal that we're trying to push in challenging the addict? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Father Emmanuel Chikoya from the Council of Churches in Zambia. I'm the General Secretary. My thought has been triggered by the joke about the newspaper and the and the Bible. And I realize sometimes they are Bible schools and theological institutions, and sometimes we don't seem to differentiate the two. There's a difference between somebody that has gone to a Bible school and a theological institution, because we learn much more than the Bible. And so basically my comment is, yes, this is a space for civil society. A lot is being shared. I feel the religious factor can be lost in the crowd. And when we get it wrong with a religious angle, whether they are teaching right things or wrong things, there can be an impediment to achieving what we want. If a prophet stands up and says, this is God ordained, whether it's a military coup or whatever, people believe. And so I just wanted to emphasize the aspect that we ignore the religious angle at our own peril. We ignore the religious factor at our own peril in Africa, because Africans are notoriously religious. And so if you want to get to them, you have a platform where you don't need to hire a venue like this one. They come every Saturday, every Sunday, every Friday at their own cost. And so it's how we can harness that potential that is there in the religious angle. And so maybe you have it already. I know we are under the All Africa Conference of Churches, and we have an office that directly engages with the African Union in Ethiopia, but I feel it's lost in the civil society branding. Let's be very deliberate in bringing and not leaving behind the religious actors, because if we do, our job will be very, very difficult to achieve. But once we get it right, the religious leaders that are well engaged, well informed, we can easily change the narrative in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, ECOSOCC, for providing this space for us. My question has to do more on what the two presenters made, one by Professor Dulani, I think, and the other one by Mr. Richard. They were emphasizing more on civil society to be more assertive, in coming up with their information that they deal with. And I was thinking that ECOSOCC has actually provided a rich space for us to network between academic and non-academic, SOs, CSOs, because according to ECOSOCC, I think civil society encompasses also academic, universities, NGOs, and so on and so forth. So I just want to, it's just a suggestion. I would like to suggest that as we are here, we have been provided this space and we need to network amongst ourselves, exchange cards, so that when research comes up, you never know who calls upon you. And the second question has to do on what the last presenter said. I just wanted to find out from him. He has selected some countries where he's doing a number of research on the digital space. I wanted to find out if at all you have also engaged the rural communities of the countries where you are working, and how is it working? Are you able to meet a lot of people or cover large grounds? Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. My name is Charles Mbobela. I'm Executive Director for I5 Governance Watch Zambia. So we've highlighted the problem, and the problem that we are discussing currently is the unconstitutional change of government in Africa. However, I've not heard much of the causes, maybe from the report. I've not really heard, from the perspective of the AU, what has been the seemingly causes of the same problem. And I feel it is extremely important for us to appreciate the possible causes of the unconstitutional change of governments in Africa, so that even other countries like Zambia can strategically position itself to avoid any such scourge. I think taking back home, I can relate this topic to what we commonly call here in Zambia, and I believe other African countries, as mob justice. This is where citizens tend to take the law in their own hands, especially those that are aggrieved. So I can relate well with this particular issue. So really what I want to ask is that there are a lot of countries that have assented to a lot of instruments by the African Union. So to what extent has the African Union continuously monitored the implementation of the AU instruments, especially the African Charter on Human and People's Rights? Because research, I managed to do a research, and it shows that the cause is that these governments are not respecting people's rights, democratic spaces, and they are deteriorating democratic institutions. So that is why people are tending to embark on unconstitutional changes of government. So really, what is the extent of the African Union to continuously monitor the implementation of the African Union instruments, specifically the SCHPR, that's the African Charter on Human People's Rights. Then the other question is that to what extent—
Can you please wrap this last one?
Yes. So the other question is that to what extent does the African Union monitor the situation of citizens' rights in member countries, specifically the African Charter on Human and People's Rights? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Mondia Paul Hakola. I'm the Executive Director of the Continental Leadership Research Institute. I'm also a practitioner of international relations and political science. The only woman on the panel gave us a challenge to say, what is it that our generation is going to do? The previous generation moved from the AU to OAU to AU. And for me, my observation really has been that mostly in Africa, we have had good policies, as my brother said there, but the challenge has been the implementation. How are we implementing these policies that are put in place? And in terms of implementation, we have had so much beautiful policies that we have on paper. But for us to see the actual implementation, there has been a serious challenge. And we have also we also need to move to a stage where we are going to change. If we change from OAU to AU, democracy has evolved in Africa. We also need to ensure that at the African Union level, what is it that we are going to put as safeguards in terms of democracy? We need to move the bar a bit higher. Mostly this big brother syndrome that we have had in Africa, where a number, because of sovereignty of different states, it's only the African Union who have the preserve to talk about some of these things. We have had a number of things that happen human rights abuses, we have democracy, we have corruption, and a number of other things that happen. But we don't see a proactive stance from the African Union. So we need to also try to look at how do we actually move in to be able to bring in a safeguard as a regional body that's supposed to look at this. We need to also move from the charter that is there to look at what is it that we have now on the ground and actually bring our solutions according to what is there. Otherwise, we have all these policies around. The challenge has been implementation. The challenge has been that we need to build the strong institutions at the African level that are going to actually help us. I thank you.
It is good we have 1.5 days more to kind of debate together, share information, share ideas, challenge each other, and so on. It does look like for a number of people in the room, maybe a few, maybe this is their first real confronting with the animal we call so it would help if we shared much more information on what the AU is. Because, for instance, when we make a recommendation and say the AU should, which part of the AU do we mean? Do we mean the Assembly of Heads of States and Government, which is a specific one of the AU? Do we mean the Executive Council, which is the ministerial body immediately below the heads of state? We should do this. Do we mean our permanent representatives in Addis Ababa, who are important conduits between the 55 member states and the AU? Do we mean the AU Commission, which is a secretariat of the AU that's based in Addis? Do we mean the Pan-African Parliament, which is our dialogue and deliberative body that's based in Midrand in South Africa, and so on? Because sometimes when we just say the AU should, it's like one of those messages of to whom it may concern. And in the end, it may end up concerning no one. So I'd like us to break in a bit more. And if more information is needed now, you know, evening time, we'll move from a talk shop. And that's what I kept on saying. This animal you call the AU will not bring you in your village, in your city, in your house. It will not bring you democracy there. It will not bring you development there. It was not designed to do that. Even if you want to talk of the full-timers that run the AU Commission, they don't have an army so that when your president misbehaves, they'll come there and slap him and take him to the local police station or the AU police station, if there's such a thing. The AU is a collective platform where our governments, and then also we, the people pushing our governments, get together to make norms together. We make these norms and these rules together using the AU. To sign up to the norms doesn't happen in Addis. Each of these 55 states have to go back home, and it's the citizens who have to push them and say, have you signed ACDEG? Have you ratified it? Are you implementing it? So the AU exists to help us negotiate the norms. It then creates institutions, some of which have compelling force, but most of which are there. So they have no compel. So like AGA cannot compel state X to do this. AGA can develop tools to encourage them to implement, you know. And then it also provides a platform for these states to voluntarily report on how they're implementing so that the cycle of encouraging and assisting can continue. But they can't compel. Indeed, there are some bodies within the AU that could compel you to do things. That's like the Peace and Security Council. But even the Peace and Security Council, it is not this employed colleagues of ours in the Peace and Security Council who issue orders like for interventions, intervene forcefully. It is the member states. It's the member states that can issue the order. So for instance, you're a Zambian, you're seeing country X, maybe Sudan, the citizens are being molested by the government, which is a fact. It is not really the bureaucrat that can order the intervention. It's about how you force your own minister to use her or his powers under the Constitutive Act, or your own head of state to use her or his powers under the Peace and Security Council to force. So I wish you could have that mind shift and see that really the action where we can cause change is within these 55 member states. How do we appropriate all this AU knowledge about the norms our states have entered into, the mechanisms by which they should act, and then we here down at the ground, we force them to act, both for our own good and in terms of people-to-people solidarity for people in the other states. I think that's one big change. Final thing I will say, the comrade from the All African Conference of Churches spoke about our independence era constitutions and said that, you know, our leaders, when they are negotiated constitutions that worked on them. No, our leaders did not negotiate constitutions. They had constitutions imposed upon them. So we start with that point. All of these constitutions, whether from London or from Paris or from Brussels or from Lisbon, were actually impositions on our people. Different countries or different groups in different countries had slightly more power in terms of negotiating some more commas, but they were impositions. That's agreed. Anyway, they didn't consult the people. How do we now go about, if we haven't done so in the last 10, 15, 20 years, writing constitutions, or like Richard put it very well, rules? It's not just a constitution, don't overrate it, but writing rules that work for our people. And then we can look at the norms. APRM and the APRM forces was for many African countries the very first opportunity that forced those that govern to have to dialogue with the citizens around the state of their political governance, around the state of their economic governance, around the state of their corporate governance, and around the state of their social governance and broad-based socioeconomic development. So if we really enter full swing into the APRM process of our country, we force our government, and there now the APRM team from Midrand would help, we force our government to have to talk to us and for us to agree. Then ACDEC then provides a sort of almost checklist for that constitution. Once you've generated using APRM, the momentum for constitutional reform, ACDEC says, this is what must happen here, this is what must happen here, this is what must happen here. But that action will be at the national level, you know? Then things like the African Union Transitional Justice Policy Framework then help you deal with your past, in the present, into the future. So my main thing is, how do we learn these tools from each other well enough and then create at the national level enough of a movement to make them happen, and not think that some bureaucrat from Addis will swoop in like somebody on a sword with a flaming sword and a flying horse and solve our problems for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Yavi?
Am I using this one? Okay, there we go. Just over a decade ago, so 12 years ago, there was a thing on this continent called the Arab Spring. Do we all remember it? When we saw news images of Sri Lanka in the past few days, it brought back memories of the Arab Spring, because when the Arab Spring happened, futurists around the world said, this is the norm of things to come. It's happening in Africa. Don't turn your back on it, because it's going to happen across the world. And as the developing world gets more and more into an economic crisis, because every time we have civil disobedience that results in some kind of uprising, like Sri Lanka, like the Arab Spring, there's an economic crisis, because it goes through processes all the political stuff, all the governance issues, everything else, and it results in people not having food on their table. And then the uprising happens. And as we are seeing playing out in Sri Lanka, the president is forced to resign. And so we don't know what's going to happen to that country over the next few years. So in terms of always looking at it in how we need to look at what we start and how we end, and what could the possibilities be if we don't get to the point of civil disobedience, because, and someone in, South Africa had riots also on the 9th of July, actually, interestingly, a year ago. And when we were talking about it, I'm an advisor to a couple of governments across the world, not only in Africa. When we were talking about it, there was a comment that was made to me by one of my colleagues, and she said, Yavi, when it comes down to it, it's the politics of the stomach. We can talk about all of these things. It comes down to the politics of the stomach. And for me, it made the biggest impact in terms of how we need to do stuff. So to come to the question that my brother at the back of the room asked, grants and funding equals aid. Aid equals reliance. Aid equals non-independence. So grants can't be our way of always looking for something. If we get grants and if we get funding, and we've had this conversation, because initially when we spoke, you were like, yes, but when we do grants and funding, we've got to become clever about how we receive that funding and how we build in capacity for future generations to not get that cycle of funding in our space. And there's various ways and means of doing it, and we don't have time for me to go into it. However, the point I'm trying to make is that if we don't alleviate ourselves from the cycle of only funding without looking at how we emancipate from it, we are going to be in a trap for the rest of time. And our future generations, your children, grandchildren will be dead and gone, and so on, will never emancipate from it. So that's the first part of the answer to the question in terms of specifically grants and funding. The second aspect of it is, how do we start to create wealth on this continent as opposed to just living by the dollar, so to speak. And that comes down to, and I'm going to give you one example because there's so many examples that I could give you, but let's talk about the thing that everyone is talking about, but no one actually knows what's going on or how it's going to actually work. Let's rather put it that way. We all know what's going on. We don't know how it's going to actually work for me. Like, how is it going to work for me? And that is the thing called the AFCFTA. The AFCFTA, speaks volumes about it's going to release 35 million out of poverty. It is going to create a $3 trillion market. And I can carry on because I know all the facts since 2018. I can do it in my sleep. Actually, I do say it in my sleep. My husband tells me. So, but how does it translate into, especially youth and women, actually seeing money in their hands? We have been given the greatest gift on earth on this continent, and that is what is in the ground, whether it's agriculture, whether it's minerals, whether it's all kinds of resources. We need to understand that we've got to create full value chains in order to be able to benefit from the AFCFTA. 1. 2, we have to learn how to like each other. Because in liking each other across the continent, and it's that whole Pan-Africanism, if we don't like each other, we won't buy from each other. If we don't buy from each other, we won't be able to have trade. We won't be able to have money. We will continue to give money outside of our borders. Here's the final thing that I want to say in regards to that. What do I mean by we will give money outside our borders? Africa is not poor. We never have been. We never will be. We have money. Must I tell you how much money we have in context of what I'm saying? When when Russia declared war on the Ukraine, we were their biggest client for wheat. 80% of what they shipped out of Ukraine came to Africa, and we paid in euros. No aid, euros. That's just one example. So we have got enough land to feed the world. We've all heard this, right? when are we going to do something about it to actually feed the world and feed each other? So that is the point I'm trying to make, is that when we stop only focusing on how amazing our policies are, and the AFCFTA is a game changer, it's historical, it's all of these amazing things. But if we need to be able to take it and put money in each of our hands sitting right here, the only way we're going to do that is to understand how it needs to translate. That means national implementation and popularization. And what is your government doing to allow you to participate in the AFCFTA national implementation? So I've given you one example. There's a couple of hundred millions, thousands that are out there in terms of how we need to build wealth on the continent. Hopefully I've answered the question in some shape or form.
Thank you. Rich, can we please clap for this lady?
Thank you very much for all those who asked questions. I don't know how many of you are still awake, but for me, I'm asleep. And let me say a couple of things. One is to add to what Yavi has just said. I now work for a research institution, an independent think tank in Uganda. And we finished a paper last year on philanthropy and foreign aid. And one of the statistics we got, when you read the World Giving Index, the top 10 countries that give most around the world, 6 of those are in Africa. And you look at the OECD numbers, the 10 top countries that receive the most aid in the world are in Africa. So it's a total contradiction that we are some of the best givers and the biggest receivers. But that is homework for all of us to think through and see how we can shift that both as a narrative and as a practice. But the point I wanted to make was really about, it's not yet out, but ECOSOCC here commissioned a piece of work last year to develop a citizen participation handbook. And the idea was to say, okay, how do we get citizens across this country, I mean across this continent, to do more work where they engage meaningfully with the AU? And I don't want to go into the presentation, but I'm sure William will call us back again in Radisson Blu, and we shall go through that whole handbook. But the idea is that, as Don was saying, I think we must, especially those of you who are in civil society, and it's now a must, it is no longer an option, that this AU must be taken back by its citizens. You must take back the AU from the leaders to the citizens. How do you do that? By actually making sure that participation becomes the norm, becomes a ground rule, okay? Because if it doesn't, there is no way the AU will work. I like his work around the digital, because all of us have smartphones, this and that. Go and do his course. I asked him to send me because I need to look at that course, and people have to do it. Why? Because unless we engage, the leaders will go to Addis. And you know, the terrible thing about it is that for the AU, every summit, they make decisions. And then the next summit comes, they make new decisions and decisions. So as you speak now, they are going to be here this weekend, make decisions in Lusaka. And those decisions in Lusaka will be coming, and then they will be on the decisions in Addis and another decision in June. And there is never enough time to implement all of them. But the only way you can force that is that when we as civil society engage in a process where we are shifting the narrative around, if you take a decision, how do we get it down? How do we get it down on the ground? And that's why this capacity building thing I was talking about is important. And I didn't get enough time because we were just 7 minutes. But the key point is we now need to realize that, and I apologize to our religious leader when I use the Bible and the newspaper. Actually, I was hiring somebody recently, and When I asked her, he said, "Oh, I read the Bible and the newspaper." I thought it was, but was serious. So it's nothing about the Bible. It is I am a Bible believer and spirit-filled Christian. But the thing is that unless we have the capacity ourselves, it will become a futile exercise of building civil society across Africa. Now, the other thing is that we also have now to take it upon ourselves to make sure that the people in the AU have got the competences to engage with us. Because the crisis now is that sometimes you have people in the same room and they are cross-talking and everybody is talking over the head of the other because they don't have the mechanics of actually engaging. Somebody does a very good report and he thinks or she thinks that the only way to get it done is by releasing it on the website and maybe doing one meeting in one region, and he calls it citizen consultation. So we must find ways in which we make these things efficient. So for me, that's my call in terms of the things that we need to do. I think that the issues around ourselves as civil society, I think I need to add one thing which I didn't go into a bit deeper, is that we have to also recognize that when we talk about civil society, let's talk about all those non-state institutions that are not part of the state. The trade unions, the religious leaders, the women's organizations, the professional organization, professional architects, engineers, who are coming together as associations. So that what drives, what defines us is not just the NGOs. Of course, the NGOs took space because of a big story around structural adjustment and what it did, but I won't go into that. But the thing is that we must now also intentionally build that true civil society. And the good thing is that, for example, for ECOSOCC, that is what the statute is about. ECOSOCC is not for NGOs. It is for all civil society, professional organizations, and everybody else. And I think for me, that's the thing that we need to do, because that's where you'll find the different competencies that will enrich the types of engagements that we have with the AU, the kinds of engagements that we have at country level. Right now, as you speak, I hope you all know that the first 10-year implementation plan of the Agenda 2063 expired. It's expiring this year. Is it 2022? Yes. So that's it. 10 years of implementation. We had an ambitious agenda. We are now left with how many? 40 years. For the youth, I think it is okay. But for me, 40 years, I will not be working very well. But that's the point. So we have used 10 years, and many people are still asking us, what is the Agenda 2063? What does it talk about? We are going into the second 10-year implementation. So now, I think to shift the narrative, that's why participation and engagement of civil society becomes important. And somebody said, yes, civil society speaks for people they have never spoken to. Well, if that is what they do, I think it is a crisis. And that we must fix ourselves. Because we can't deny, yes, there are so many. There are many briefcases, there are many. But for me, I always tell people that you also have to understand one thing. Every civil society organization starts in a briefcase. The only problem is how long do you stay in your briefcase? Okay? Because, yes, you first have to have an idea on paper before you register it, before you get an office, before you get funding. But the problem is, it's like a pregnancy. If a pregnancy is in the stomach for 9 months, everybody is okay when you finish 9 months and give birth. But when you go to 24 months of pregnancy, then we have to get a special doctor. So that's the problem with civil society, that for many civil society organizations, they have these pregnancies that have gone beyond 9 months. And that's what we need to fix ourselves, which means that we must do the things that will help those who have good ideas to make sure that they are able to be implemented on time, so that you don't have people thinking that they'll go around doing the wrong things. Because that requires a number of things. It requires better incentives, information, helping people to be incubated, you know, organizing in such a way that you support those who have good ideas. It's many things. Because sometimes when we think about crooks only, yeah, crooks are there. You know, even central banks deal with people who forge money, but they have never closed. So let's not close civil society because somebody is having a briefcase that doesn't work. So for me, those are the ways in which I pragmatically think about these issues. And I invite you to also use the same frame. Thank you very much.
Thank you for clapping for him. Now,
okay, thank you very much. Just to quickly respond to some of the questions that were directed to me, I will just say in general that yes, the project that we are trying to undertake as Charter Project Africa does take into consideration some of the challenges that were highlighted by one of the speakers with regards to the violations that happen online and the risks that digital activists are exposed to. And one of the things we hope to do is share community of practice on how best to mitigate those challenges. But also importantly, we have tools that we want to make freely available on how to practice activism safely online. Some digital tools that protect human rights defenders online, and that will be available on our platform. I encourage people to engage with. And that also, yes, experience sharing and skill sharing is also part of the inbuilt aspect of the project through facilitating a series of dialogues that we will hope to have eventually at the sub-regional level, where we can then take note of some of the themes emerging on democratic governance, and yes, some of the best practices that we can learn from each other. Now, in closing, what I will say is with regards to the theme of unconstitutional changes of government that brought us all together here, and listening to everything that's been said over the last sessions and plenaries, I think we need to acknowledge in some way or form our democratic governance conversation has broken down somewhere. And unconstitutional changes of government is a symptom of that breakdown. Now, the question is what we then do about it. Because I think one of the key factors that has stood out is even when my brother here was speaking about the different perceptions and surveys of the public, we are dealing with a scenario where public trust in governments is eroding fast, not in democracy. They trust democracy, they just don't trust the governments to deliver said democracy. And also, yes, civil society as well, as you now mentioned, falls into that space in terms of also being indicted in terms of what we are doing to restore that conversation and stem the breakdown of democratic governance. And so that's why I think it calls for a very strong multi-stakeholder effort. All of us who are concerned in this democratic governance conversation need to come together. We need to leverage our different strengths, our different initiatives, and work towards a common purpose, which should be to amplify the voices and facilitate the voices of the citizenry, not stand in their way. So again, the question of agency becomes very important, and I agree we can't, even as civil society organizations, constantly stand in for the voices of the public in a way that undermines their own speech. And that's why one of the things we try to push as our project around civic technology and digital engagement is also trying to acknowledge where these conversations happen. How are people organizing? So while I have pushed forward the agenda for civic technology and digital engagement as one of those ways and one of those spaces, it by no means is the only space for engagement. I think the important thrust should be, let us start acknowledging where people are organizing around these issues, where they're having their conversations around these issues. And if we are in a position to be facilitative, let our organizing question be how we shrink the spaces between the so-called powerful and the so-called powerless. If we work on that modality, we will then begin to see how we can reconstruct and put back on track the question of democratic governance in the continent and push back against the negative aspects we are beginning to see, such as unconstitutional changes in government. Thank you.
So it's been a long, long day, and I don't want to speak too long. I think there's a lot that's already been said. Let me just take this opportunity to invite, I think, all the civil society organizations and the participants that are here to engage not only the Afrobarometer, but our fellow academics to also get access to some of this research data. For the Afrobarometer, the data are available online and are for free. And if anyone is really interested, they can also reach out to us and we'll be very happy to prepare for different countries, different organizations, different thematic areas, not only on governance, but on environment, on gender-based violence, issues to do with gender, employment, you name it. We all have that, and we'll be very happy to share that data and information so that we as a civil society, as we've heard from my colleagues, are not also making the same mistake that the politicians making, claiming to know and speak on behalf of the people. I think as a civil society, we also owe it to the people we claim to represent to make sure we listen to them and we hear to them, and we can then project their voices and also hold those in power to account using the voices of the people. Thank you.
So we've come to the end of this graveyard session, but I'm pretty sure we've had a very interesting conversation from public opinion to digital democracy to capacity building and civil society strengthening. So the money woman who is talking about generating more money for the continent, until then to Donald, who has dissected the problem of the African Union and the mystification of the African Union. On behalf of ECOSOCC, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to research your presentations and for going into details to explain these issues. And also to all of you who are in the plenary for those very interesting questions and for your patience in being here till this time when some of you should be home in your hotel rooms enjoying the day. Let us put our hands together for ourselves as we close the session.